Did Jack the Ripper communicate with the authorities? Did he leave behind clues that could have led to his capture or identity? We're going to be really focusing in on events surrounding the Catherine Eddowes crime scene, the fourth canonical victim in the Jack the Ripper saga. So let's put this to the pub test. G'day, I'm Owen, and we're asking the question initially, did Jack the Ripper actually communicate with the police, with the papers, and with vigilance committees? Well, we're going to dive into that, but to start with, could we get an understanding of the mind of this particular historical serial perpetrator? So the following, we ask, could this have been Jack the Ripper? Let me read. This is the story of my progression into becoming a serial killer. Like anyone just starting out in a new skill, I had a bit of trial and error in the beginning of my misadventures. Allow me to start from the beginning, and I think you'll see what I mean. I don't remember the exact place and time it was that I decided to become a serial killer. But I remember the sensation that hit me when I committed to the decision. It was a rush of pure euphoria. I felt lighter, less stressed, if you will, at the freedom of the prospect. There was something about urgently exploring my dark side that greatly appealed to me, and I'm such a methodical planner and thinker, the very challenge itself was enticing to behold. This realization was just the last in a series of new discoveries I'd made about myself. I just knew I was different somehow from the rest of humanity. I feel no such emotions as empathy or sympathy towards others, for example. Of course, when it came to actual one-on-one conversations with therapists, I had to lie. I mean, talk about leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. The last thing I needed to do was air out all my darkest fantasies and half-formed plans to someone who is legally obligated to contact the authorities if they think a patient will do harm to themselves or others. I'm not stupid. Nevertheless, deception aside, it was a useful exercise to get to know my label better. When a man approaches 30 years of age, he tends to question what his ultimate purpose in this world and where he fits into the picture. Fate has already decided everyone's time to die from the moment they are born. When it's their time, it's their time, and if they do not die of old age or sickness, when their time comes, other factors are employed by fate to get the job done. I think about that whenever I plan to kill. It's not me who chooses the victims, but fate. Oh sure, I choose the victim to match my own criteria in the interest of remaining free and at large, but for the most part I am merely following my own nature, which was devised by the grand design of the universe. Now this does not mean I shirk responsibility for my actions. I'm obviously, as you will come to learn, deliberate, level-headed, and very much in control of my own actions. Although I won't deny that the aforementioned scenario would play well in an insanity plea. So here I was, armed with this new insight into my inner self and an exhilarating new hobby that I was seeking to undertake. I thought long and hard to come up with a system that would work for me, a method that would ensure I could have my playtime and keep from getting caught. It didn't take long before I settled on an MO. My first question, who do I want to target? Signed by Jack the... Actually, no, that was not Jack the Ripper. That was a bloke, I think his name's Mark Titchell, something like that. His name is not important. He was known as the Dexter Killer, and they found apparently this sort of like musing written on his computer when he finally got caught. He was luring people through dating apps, like pretending to be a woman and getting these blokes in, and then he was murdering them, and it was just absolutely dreadful. But the thing is, when reading through that, could we not see how that could easily be the progression of someone back in Whitechapel in 1888? Rather than being a syphilitic person who's gone mad, we could see someone who was very cold, very calculating, and also learnt along the way from the mistakes that they made. Now, this bloke did not, this Mark Titchell or whatever his name is, did not try to contact authorities, to my knowledge at least. And many serial killers don't, but some do. There was the brownout strangler in Australia during World War II in Melbourne, who he was a United States serviceman stationed in Melbourne, and he went round and murdered a few women. But it appears that after the very first crime that he did contact authorities, not the Australian authorities, but the military police on the base, and effectively gave himself up. Now, there is debate about that because he didn't give a name. But the point is, sometimes that is what these people will do. They will leave clues for their capture. Because that bloke, and it's an interesting case because he was on Australian soil, but due to treaties and everything, he was tried under United States law on Australian soil by the military police. Now, he basically was grateful when he got caught because he said, look, someone had to stop me, because in his own mind he couldn't stop himself. And so we do see that not every serial killer acts the same. Some are more than happy to keep on going without getting caught. Others feel that need to get themselves arrested so that this whatever's going wrong in their brain can stop. So the question then is, which one does Jack the Ripper fall into? And with all the communications that were sent in, did he leave behind clues? Well, we are going to look, as I mentioned at the start, closely at the Catherine Eddowes crime in Mitre Square. Now, if you are not familiar with Jack the Ripper, just very quickly, Catherine Eddowes was the fourth official canonical victim and the second person murdered on the double event evening. Elizabeth Stride, her body had been found, but then only a couple of hours later, the body of Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. But there are some intriguing details surrounding this particular case that we're going to look at. There was, from this event, a letter sent in, which is known as From Hell. And there was the Goulston Street graffiti, found 3 streets away, as well as part of Catherine Eddowes' apron right near that graffiti. Now, the thing is, if the From Hell letter is genuine and was written by Jack the Ripper, then he did not write the graffiti. But if Jack the Ripper wrote the graffiti, then the From Hell letter is a fake. Then there's also that possibility that Jack the Ripper didn't write either of them. So let's look at these letters. Now, to start with, the generally most famous letters are the Dear Boss letters sent to the police, and that's the ones that gave Jack the Ripper it's the moniker. Before then, known as the Whitechapel Fiend or Leather Apron and all these other things. But all of a sudden, when these Dear Boss letters became known, then the name Jack the Ripper entered into our speech, and he's still very well known because of those. Yet, 2 journalists have come out and said, well, we wrote them. We were doing it to get a bit of traction in the papers because the police, particularly Sir Charles Warren, and the papers were not working well together, and so the press were making things up. Now, the point I want to make here, because it's often just discounted saying those letters could not have been real, but it's likely too that years later when these press people came out and said, oh, we made it all up, that also sold some newspapers. So we can't just discount them because someone claimed to have written them themselves. Personally, I don't think that they were genuine. Yet, most people in Ripperology believe if there is a letter that would be real, it was the one written to George Lusk after the Catherine Eddowes murder. Now, in that letter that he received was part of a kidney. There is debate about whether it was an animal kidney, human kidney. They say that it was tested and it had a particular disease, this kidney, that Catherine Eddowes didn't have. So whether it was hers, it is still open to debate, but it is known that she was missing a kidney. Now that could have been known in the press, so whoever was maybe playing a prank on George Lusk, they probably would have known that that was a part of the body that was removed. George Lusk himself, when he received it, paid no attention to it at all. He just discarded it. But for some reason, he held on to the kidney, which I find also just a little bit weird. But George Lusk himself was the head of one of the vigilance committees in Whitechapel. And he formed it himself because he was a businessman. So he got a few businessmen together and said, we don't want our area being known for, poverty and being a slum. Because that's all that the press are talking about. So we want to raise the level so that we can make this place better. And the only way we can do that is to end this Jack the Ripper nonsense. So they're out on the street trying to catch the bloke themselves. But they had skin in the game. They put their money where their mouth was. That they were hiring people and they were doing what they had to do. So you could understand why Jack the Ripper may have targeted this bloke, because he did have quite the profile at the time. But when he showed this letter to people and they're like, that could be genuine. But it's also known, and look, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I mean, British people are often misunderstood from my perspective anyway. Because around the world, you generally see things like Downton Abbey and you see the Lord of the Manor and the servants living downstairs and all that. And that's what people think most British are like. Just these very, I just can't really think of the exact word that I want, but very formal and very well-to-do. That is the wrong perception of the majority of British people. Because, it's the British that brought us Monty Python and things like that. So their humour can be very irreverent. And my point to that is just listen to a soccer chant in England. It's rather frightening, some of the things that they are prepared to chant in a 40,000 seat stadium. The thing is, and it's probably a long way of getting to the point that some medical students may have been wanting to play a little bit of a joke on George Lusk and send him some body parts. Now that there's even suggestion that the Thames Torso murders were medical students having a bit of a laugh by leaving body parts strewn everywhere. So this From Hell letter could have just been part of that type of dark humour, but there is something that needs to be noted, and it's the fact that whether George Lusk himself came to the realization or it was pointed out to him, the fact he received this letter should have really concerned him greatly. And you're probably wondering, well, what is that realization? Well, whether it was a medical student just having a bit of a laugh, whether it was just someone who had something against him trying to put the wind up him, or was Jack the Ripper himself, no matter what that scenario was, they knew where he lived. They knew his house. George Lusk had a family. So you don't know what crazy has sent you this kidney in the post. But now you're going to be very concerned for your family. So this idea of trying to catch this person who has outwitted the police, outwitted the public, outwitted your vigilance committee, you now take a step back. Because, it is at this point that George Lusk does become less prominent and the Vigilance Committee isn't as active as it was. And I don't think that is coincidental. But what is important, and why I said at the start that the From Hell letter and the graffiti found in Goulston Street 3 streets away couldn't be both done by the same person, is because the From Hell letter is just like really garbled, basically. The grammar is terrible. The spelling is not good. Whereas it said, when PC Long found the apron in an archway in Goulston Street and then saw the graffiti, well, that graffiti was written with proper grammar. The people who saw it, and we're going to get into why no one really knows what it said or what it looked like, but the people who did see it said it showed someone who was educated. So that meant like the handwriting, that they used proper capitalization, and then the other letters were all in proportion. And it was written above like a door jamb, so above this archway in Goulston Street. But now Sir Charles Warren has turned up on the scene, and he says that we're going to get rid of it. Now, there was an argument taking place between the Metro Police, so Scotland Yard, and the City Police. And one side is saying, we need to get a photo of this. And Charles Warren's like, no, we're not. Now, it's funny, and I don't know if it's still the same, but Scotland Yard, and I think it was the City Police were the other jurisdiction, there was a line where if you crossed it, if you're a policeman on one side, say you work for Scotland Yard and you crossed that line, you no longer had any authority. You were just a person basically in fancy dress. And so Sir Charles Warren, this graffiti was in his jurisdiction. And so despite the arguments from the other side, he said, no, we are not keeping it. And people say that was such a mistake. And I'm not saying it wasn't. But what I can understand is his reasoning as to why he didn't want to keep that graffiti up there. Because there was at least a reference to Jews. And so he was worried about anti-Semitism. But not only that, his relationship with the press was absolutely dreadful. He was getting hammered. And so you could just imagine now what would have happened on the front page of every paper. This graffiti would have just made headlines everywhere. And he said, this probably has nothing to do with the case. So let's just get rid of it so these press people can't sensationalize the issue. Now, rightly or wrongly, I understand why he did that. But because of that decision, no photograph was taken of what was written on that archway. Well, there's now been such debate about the exact phrasing, the exact spelling of the word Jews, and so it goes on. But why would they make the connection to Jack the Ripper with some random graffiti? Because graffiti was pretty much around everywhere, particularly in this area. People were writing stuff on walls constantly. Well, it's because that PC Long found the apron in Goulston Street right near that graffiti. Now, he found it around 2:45 a.m., roughly. That was long after Catherine Eddowes' body was found in Mitre Square. And PC Long would have walked past that archway at least once, possibly twice, in the time from when Catherine Eddowes was murdered in Mitre Square to when this piece of apron was found. And so straight away, it would look like that Jack the Ripper has returned to the area and dropped that apron and then written this graffiti. Now, could PC Long have missed seeing that apron earlier? Was it just accidentally discarded by the perpetrator? Because there is very, very little doubt that the piece of material found was Catherine Eddowes' apron. And we're going to talk about that because it is critical to this particular discussion. Well, the streets were filthy though. Like a little bit of material on the ground could easily be missed. So now if you're a serial killer and you're trying to make a statement, as I say, like the brownout murderer, trying to leave a clue to who you are so that they can find you so this madness can stop, where would you write the graffiti and where would you leave your clue? Well, probably in Mitre Square. Like you may have had the time, or at least had a chance to quickly scrawl something on the wall, and then that would have been a message. Why would you go 3 streets away, plant a piece of material in hope that someone's going to find it, and then write your message? It just doesn't really make a lot of sense, particularly when you think that that piece of material may never have been found. That could have easily have been lost in history. Except, this was no small piece of material. It said it was, like in the inquests and everything, it basically says it was half the apron. That's a fair chunk. So the women would wear these full aprons. Half of it cut off, that's not a small amount. But why would Jack the Ripper cut off half of this apron? Because before, it's generally thought that maybe it was to clean up his hands because some like fecal matter had come on him because it accidentally cut into the bowel. I mean, I know that is horrific, but that's what happened. But see, there's another possibility here that is possibly likely. He had removed a few body parts from Catherine Eddowes, and he may have used that apron to carry them. Because it is a bit of a myth, this person walking around with a bag. Of all the eyewitnesses of people who think they saw Jack the Ripper, no one really ever says the bloke was carrying a bag. That's just basically come into the saga from later times, but we don't really see that in any inquests. So how are you going to carry these bits away? Well, scoop them up in this apron. But then why would you dump the apron? Surely what's going to happen with these body parts you're taking away? Well, this is where the suggestion is that Jack the Ripper had somewhere to go. He had somewhere where he could go and stash the parts, and then, as a bit of a laugh, goes out and plants this apron. Now, understanding it was a fair chunk of material, that most likely would not have been easy to miss. So all of a sudden it does lend weight to PC Long saying that definitely wasn't there when I went past previous. Yet we can't be definitive on that either. Because just knowing that, the Whitechapel was in heightened sense of alert because of the previous 2 crimes of Annie Chapman and Polly Nichols. But some time had gone by. 3 weeks had almost passed with no attacks. Now, if you're walking the beat, you're doing this every single night, it's possible that perhaps you weren't as vigilant as you could have been. But you're not going to tell your superiors that. You're not going to say, I was just, like going into a tea house or, maybe just not necessarily doing this whole patrol because, the streets were rough. There were gangs. You were on your own. I mean, it wasn't exactly the safest job to be doing. So maybe you wouldn't have taken it as serious as you should. But then when this event happens and you've heard of the attack that's happened down at Dutfield's Yard, when Elizabeth Stride was murdered, and they're saying Jack the Ripper's on the street now. All of a sudden you're out and about, and lo and behold, you find this chunk of apron. But you're going to say that you walked past there at least once, maybe twice. You were definitely doing your job, but there's no absolute proof that he was. So that is also a possibility that has to be factored in. So what can we gain from all of this? If we're investigating this, what conclusions can we draw? Well, the From Hell letter and that piece of kidney, even if it was genuine, it's not helping us in this investigation because that only came to light down the track. You may look into why the person contacted George Lusk. Is there someone who could be the perpetrator that has some connection in his past? You'd probably dig into that, but I don't think it would lead too far. The graffiti, I just would discount it. I wouldn't have rubbed it off. I would have wanted a photo, but it's not something I would have spent a lot of time trying to analyze and work out because there was graffiti pretty much everywhere, and who knows what the person was trying to say regardless. The apron, I would question PC Long about whether or not he was really on the beat, even if it was off the record. Look, buddy, honestly, was that your first time walking past there? Because I think that is critical. But the one thing that we definitely can take away from that evening is that Jack the Ripper did go to Goulston Street at some stage. Either not long after the attack in Mitre Square, or possibly does have somewhere to hide and re-emerged and disappeared somewhere else. Now, it is interesting, too, that is the one piece of evidence that we have from this crime. And that piece of apron is now lost. It is funny that the DNA evidence that people refer to with Jack the Ripper in recent times comes from a shawl that may or may not have ever been at the crime scene in the first place. But the thing that we know definitely was and would have contained DNA, we don't have access to anymore. But with that in mind, the next Jack the Ripper video here on the Pub Test will be looking at a suspect that may fit this description. So keep an eye out for that one. But let me know what you think. Do you feel that sort of confession letter from a recent serial killer matches the description of what Jack the Ripper could possibly be? So rather than looking at someone who's descending into madness, are we more looking at someone who is cold, calculating, and just their mind is triggered to do these events and have their fun time? But regardless, let me know what you think, and thank you to everyone who is liking, viewing, subscribing, sharing, and doing all those things. It is genuinely appreciated. I'm Owen. You've been watching the Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.